Disc 14.
The elephant in the living room of all twin studies is the genetics of intelligence. How much of our smarts is determined by our genes? Everyday experience suffices to prove there is a lot of variation out there. While teaching at Harvard, I became intimately acquainted with the familiar pattern. In any population, there are a few who really aren't too bright, a few who are alarmingly smart, and a vast majority who are middling. The fact that the setting was Harvard, where the population had been pre-selected in favor of intelligence, makes no difference. The same proportions hold, whatever the group. This bell curve distribution, of course, can describe just about any trait that varies in humans. Most of us are medium tall, but there are a few super tall and a few super short among us. But when used to describe variations in human intelligence, the bell curve has demonstrated powers to raise a dust storm of objection. The reason is that in a land of equal opportunity, where we are each free to advance as far as our wits will carry us, intelligence is a trait with profound socioeconomic implications. The measure of it is predictive of how one will fare in life. And so in this matter, the nature-nurture debate becomes entangled with the noble aspirations of our meritocratic society. But given the complex interplay of the two factors, how can we reliably judge their respective weights? Smart parents not only pass on smart genes, they also tend to rear their children in ways that foster intellectual growth, thus confounding the effects of genes and environment. This is the reason careful twin studies are so valuable in permitting us to analyze the constituents of intelligence. Bouchard's study and earlier ones as well have found that as much as 70% of the variation in IQ is attributable to corresponding genetic variation, a strong argument for the primacy of nature over nurture. But does this really mean that our intellectual fate is largely sealed by our genes, that education, even our own free will, has little to do with who we are? Not at all. As with all traits, it is nice to be blessed with favorable genes, but there is much that nurture can do to influence the standing of any individual, at least in the bell curve's vast midland, where variations in social circumstance are mainly determined. Take the case of one group within Japan, the Buraku. They are the descendants of Japanese who, by feudal custom, had once been condemned to perform society's unclean tasks, like slaughtering animals. Despite the modernization of Japanese society, the Buraku remain impoverished and marginalized outsiders, scoring on average 10 to 15 IQ points lower than the national Japanese mean. Are they genetically inferior? Or is their IQ simply a reflection of their lowly status in Japan? It would seem to be the latter. Buraku, who have immigrated to the United States, where they are indistinguishable from other Japanese Americans, have shown an increase in IQ, and over time, the 15-point gap with their fellows in the homeland disappears. Education matters. In 1994, Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein published The Bell Curve, arguing that despite the well-established effect of education, the discrepancies in the average IQ scores of different races may themselves be attributable to genes. It was a profoundly controversial claim, but not as simple-minded as many have supposed. Murray and Herrnstein understood that the combined observations of a genetic basis to IQ and of differences in average IQ among groups do not lead directly to the conclusion that genes are responsible for the intergroup differences. Imagine sowing the seeds of a particular plant species in which height varies genetically. Put one set of seeds in a tray with high-grade soil and another in a tray of poor soil. In both trays, we see variation in height. Some individuals are taller than others, as expected, given genetic variation. But we also observe that the average height for plants in the tray of poor soil is less than the average for those in the tray of rich earth. The environment in the form of soil quality has affected the plants. While genetics is the dominant factor in determining height differences among plants within a tray, all other factors being equal, genetics has nothing to do with the differences seen between the two trays. Does this same argument apply to African Americans who lag behind other Americans in measures of IQ? Since poverty rates among African Americans are relatively high, with a large proportion of individuals finding themselves rooted in the relatively poor educational soil of the inner city, environment surely does contribute to their underperformance on IQ tests. Murray and Herrnstein's point, however, was that the discrepancy was so great that environment likely couldn't explain it all. Similarly, environmental factors alone may not account for why, globally, Asians have on average higher IQs than other racial groups. The idea of measurable variations in average intelligence among ethnic groups is not one, I admit, I want to live with. But though the bell curve's claims remain questionable, we should not allow political anxieties to keep us from looking into them further. There is perhaps no more heartening proof of the role of environment in human intelligence than the Flynn effect, the worldwide phenomenon of upwardly trending IQ, named for the New Zealand psychologist who first described it. Since the early years of the 20th century, gains have ranged between 9 and 20 points per generation in the United States, Britain, and other industrialized nations for which reliable data sets are available. With our knowledge of evolutionary processes, we can be sure of one thing. We are not seeing the wholesale genetic change in the global population. No, these changes must be recognized as largely the fruits of improvement in overall standards, both of education and of health and nutrition. Other factors as yet not understood doubtless play a role. But the Flynn effect serves nicely to make the point that even a trait whose variation is largely determined by genetic differences is, in the end, significantly malleable. We are not mere puppets upon whose strings our genes alone tug.